In 2020, an exhibition at the Museum of Mariemont about the Merovingian period and the ERC project Rural Riches were the occasion to focus on craft production from this period, especially on the pottery production. The experiment and our talk today have a double purpose. At first, answer to an archaeological questions related to potter's kiln. Secondly, they were the occasion to test a methodological tool for experimental archaeology. Merovingian ceramics show a fairly homogeneous shapes and decoration over quite extended territory. On the other hand, the techniques vary. The precise definition of the chaîne opératoire should therefore make it possible to define communities and to follow the spread of practices. In this context, tools play an essential role. Martin van Apperen, from the project Rural Riches, gathered the data concerning the potters' workshops between the Seine and the Rhine. Their kilns vary regarding their states of preservation, their sizes and shapes, sometimes even in the same agglomeration. However, it is difficult to understand the technical and social meaning of these variations. Therefore, we tested distinct types of kilns for which the dating and the types of production are quite similar. We wanted to assess the extent to which these tools were different. In addition to their performances, we also addressed questions of social organizations. Thanks to the Awap, we had the great opportunity to work with recent discoveries from close areas very well excavated and well documented. The first one is the kiln of Namur. In the middle of 2020, a particularly well-preserved potter's kiln was discovered in Namur on the banks of the river Meuse. The structure is almost 2 meters long and 1.20 meters wide. It has a pear-shaped plan. The combustion chamber is buried and its walls are covered with small to medium-sized blocks of sandstone, covered with clay. About 50 centimeters from the ground, the walls have a slight projection to support the floor, which also rests on an axial wall built of sandstone and clay. The floor was placed on planks of wood that left traces in the fired clay. The floor is also pierced with at least 8 peripheral vent holes. Above the floor, 2 ranks of stone were preserved. They slightly retracted, initiating the covering of the firing chamber by a vault. Given the thickness of the ribbing and the duration from 15 to 30 centimeters, it is clear that this kiln was used several times. The first analysis of the material placed in the kiln reveals that the walls were made between the quarter of the 6th century and probably the 7th century. The second kiln, the one of Kevy, was excavated in 2015. It was found in a silty soil. It consists of a circular chamber with an internal diameter of 80 centimeters, preserved to a depth of 60 centimeters. To the east, the stocking chamber is short and very narrow. It leads to a work area that was quite well preserved. The lower part of the combustion chamber is excavated in bell-shaped profile, and the central pillar is preserved in the silt. The bottom of the chamber is practically not rubbed, unlike the side walls and the central support, which are rubbed to a thickness of 2 to 5 centimeters. No traces of a floor or of its removal were found on the central pillar or on the side of the heating chamber. These two were quite intact. So we assume that the batch was placed directly on the pillar. In absence of a departure of a vault, the shape of the firing chamber is supposed to be a shaft. The material found in the kiln is dated between the end of the 7th century and the 8th century. Due to the COVID, the experiment had to be reorganized several times. From June 2019 until March 2020, based on archaeological ceramics, the potters from the Ceram Histo group made nearly 250 pots, bowls and jugs. They were then left to dry for a quite long period, because the construction of the kilns could only start from April 2021. Due to the sanitary crisis, we also had to reorganize the experiment into phases. We built and fired the kilns separately. The construction of the first kiln, based on the discovery of Namur, required a lot of material. It lasted for 5 days, with a team of at least 4 people per day. It was finally completed under the snow. Therefore, the kiln was left to dry and protected for over a month. Given the condition during its construction, and in order to not compromise the interload, we decided to fire the kiln a fourth time empty up to 700 degrees. The construction of the kiln based on the model of Kevi was much more faster and required less material. Only 2 of us worked for 2 days. Then a small fire was lit to dry the structure, which was then protected by a roof. The next day, the kiln could be loaded for firing. In the kiln of Namur, in order to preserve the floor, 73 pots were placed in the firing chamber, but it could have held double. A door was then bricked up with clay. For the kiln of Kevi, the loading was the most delicate and complex step, because the pots had to be placed in equilibrium between the central pillar and the walls. About 100 pots were placed in the kiln. Probes were used to record the temperatures second by second, inside and outside the kilns. In the kiln from Namur, the temperatures were easy to control. Their rise was low, regular and quite homogeneous. In less than 5 hours, the kiln reaches 900 degrees. The kiln was then closed with tiles, and only 1/8 of a stair of wood was needed for the firing. For the kiln from Kevi, it was, on the contrary, very difficult to raise the temperatures. Maintaining and homogenizing them was also very complicated. Still, after 5 hours of hard work, 800 degrees were reached. The kiln was then closed and covered with branches coated with slip. It was closed with a metal plate. Nearly half of a stair of wood was burned during these 5 hours. When the kilns were opened, in the case of Namur, almost the entire load was in good state. For the kiln of Kevi, the temperature's variations caused a lot of breakage. Half of the pots came out in good condition, the other half were damaged. When preparing and evaluating this experiment, a methodological analysis sheet was used. This tool was designed and implemented previously by Demelenne within our doctoral research dedicated to historical mortars and the manufacture of lime. The objective of this tool is to structure our experimental approach in order to minimize the bias. If experimental archaeology is to be considered as a valid contribution to research, it is necessary to use evaluation criteria which are accepted by all. The grid can be used as an observation and analysis tool, but also as a memory aid when preparing experimental archaeology activities. If we take a look at the structure and content, the aim is to define the various parameters which may cause problems. The form also allows to consider the various aspects of an experiment in a structured and coherent way. 160 criteria that we cannot detail here are divided in 4 main sections. At first, the title and the general observation, objectives, mean, duration. Then the scientific aspects, the support, the hypothesis, the methodology, and the result. Thirdly, the pedagogical aspect, what is communicated to the audience and how. And finally, the ethical aspects, what are the sources of support, funding, what social and environmental integration does have the experiment. The analysis sheet, completed by an interview with the main experimenters, made it possible to highlight the deviation and compromises. At first, the methodological modification and the splitting of the cycle. The 2 experiments were planned to be carried out at the same time under the same climatic condition in order to be able to compare them. But the COVID crisis prevented this. The division of the cycle meant that the kilns were built and used under different climatic conditions, and the comparison has to consider that. Secondly, the structural modification, the prefiring of one of the 2 structures. The climate that was very cold for the season made it necessary to pre-fire the kiln from Namur to assure that the flow was strong enough to support the load. The pre-firing greatly improved the performance of the kiln. Aware of this bias, the experimenters were all more careful to record the data in a coherent and equivalent manner in order to produce a relevant comparison of the 2 processes. Thirdly, the form distinguishes the participants by their quality. Different types of mastery are identified: the know-how, the experience, the expertise. Here, 2 types of expertise were represented, by the potters and by the archaeologists. In the case of pyrotechnologies, the role of the fire master is essential. His or her experience and know-how are key to success. In this case, the sensory perception of the fire was decisive. The sounds of the fire, the colors, the size and movements of the flames, the smells, the color of the product being fired. The posture of the fire master and his position in relation to the rest of the team and to the kiln are indicators of the interaction, of the hierarchy, and of the organization of the work and processes. In conclusion, the kiln of Kevy was easy to build, but it was much more unpredictable during the firing. On the opposite, the building of the kiln of Namur needed more time, people, and material, but it was very efficient during the firing. The kiln of Namur is in the tradition of the Roman kilns, but the one of Kevy appears as a new solution, perhaps even a trial, which required less work for its construction, but needed a great mastery of the firing process. The form that we used was of great help. The structuring of a list of observable and quantifiable criteria allows the identification of methodological biases arises in a complex in vivo process. The framework and the meticulous preparation liberated time and gave the experimenters intellectual and material availability. Finally, the use of this sheet also allows attention to be paid on organic, complex, typically human elements, which are often the key to archaeological interpretation. Thanks for your attention, and thanks to our sponsors.